Welcome everyone to the UCALR University Council on Water Resources webinar series on emerging voices of tribal perspectives in water resources. This is webinar 1 of 2. The first one that we're having today is on tribal waters and climate change. The second one will be webinar 2 on tribes and water quality and quantity on May 23rd. You will find the recordings online at the UCALR website. This issue has 8 papers, and you can find the issue publicly accessible on the UCALR website. This issue came about from conversations stemming back from the Las Vegas UCALR conference, where we talked about elevating the water challenges facing tribal nations. And from there at the Fort Collins conference, we developed a special session and then invited several others to submit papers to the special issue. So the special issue really gives a foundational understanding of water challenges facing tribal communities, first from understanding the self-determination and tribal sovereignty in managing the water, disparities in water quality across Indian country, tribal economies, including looking at tribal college priorities, various case studies in different tribes, including the Lumbee tribe and Anishinaabe people, and then finally concluding with 2 examples of environmental and water monitoring on the Navajo Nation. I'm pleased to say that this issue had a majority of the lead authors being Native American, with such low numbers of Native Americans in the sciences, much less the hydrologic sciences. It's great that we were able to have authors from the tribal communities write their papers in this issue. Also, that we had representation from tribal colleges. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and start the webinar introducing this first presentation by Bonnie, Colby, and Suhina Deol. Bonnie Colby is a professor at the University of Arizona. She's worked with dozens of tribal nations in the Western United States on water settlements, litigation, and reservation management. Suhina Deol has completed her undergraduate degree in economics from Missouri State University and has her MS in applied econometrics and data analysis. So with that, I will give the presentation over to the first speaker.
We're very pleased to participate in this webinar series, honored to be part of this group, as well as in the special issue that Karletta and many others worked hard to bring to fruition over a year or more of persistent work. So my topic with my colleague Suhina Deol, we're both economists. I've had the privilege of working with many different tribal governments on tribal agencies and also federal agencies that coordinate with tribes over the past 30 years. And as an economist, I've naturally been attentive to the articulated aspiration to have more vibrant tribal economies and livelihood opportunities on reservations, not only for those currently living on the reservations, but for future generations of tribal members and for tribal communities to participate actively in the larger regional economies of which they are part. So next slide. So what we were interested in, since tribes are sovereign managers of their, we're still waiting for the next slide. Next one. Thank you. So since tribes are sovereign managers of data generated related to reservation resources, reservation economic activities, tribal government programs, some information is naturally held by the tribe related to economic planning and development. we were curious if one wanted to look across a sampling of tribal nations, are there publicly accessible data that would provide useful patterns, something that's thought-provoking and valuable to tribal officials thinking about the future and livelihood opportunities on their reservations? So data is scarce on tribal economic development, and exploring what can be learned from publicly accessible data was one of the principal goals of this project. And since the focus of this overall series and also most of my work with tribal nations has been on water and water using activities on reservations, we wanted to focus on agriculture on reservations as well and look for patterns across regions that might be useful and illuminating in terms of the good mix of possibilities for additional economic development related to reservation communities. Suhina.
Thank you. So as Bonnie described, we used really publicly accessible data and tried to compile what was out there. So we created a really unique combined data set from data from the USDA, the Census Bureau, court decrees, and a bunch of other sources that were out there, and just really putting them in one place. And while there are lots of other variables that we would have loved to look at, it was very hard to get accessibility to them. So we only looked at what we could have from 2010 to 2015, with 51 tribes included in our study. We had 41 tribes in 2010, and we were able to get consistent data for 10 more tribes in 2015. So the variables that we looked at in this study was agriculture products sold. We looked at reservation unemployment, income, population. And then what we kind of really brought to the study from our side is we looked at whether the tribal reservation was located close to a major city. We looked at if a tribe operated a casino or not. And we looked at if they had any water settlements through both 2010 and 2015. And if we look at this data at a whole, at their averages, we can really see that their agriculture products sold average was about 58.6 million. Their unemployment rates were quite high on average at 17.3 on tribal reservations versus if you look at the U.S. national economy unemployment rate. The average income level for people who had an income on a family level was $48,000. The average population size on the reservations we examined was 11,000. And if we look at the proximity to a major city, we can really see that the majority of our tribes were not located close to a major city. However, 73% had a casino, and only 40% had quantified their water rights. So to really look at these variables and look at the differences in means across the tribal nations, we use Ttest analysis. And we use this Ttest analysis to examine the difference between whether a tribe had their water rights and whether they did not, tribes that had a casino compared to tribes who did not, proximity to major city, and then the regions of the tribes. So what really are the differences between tribes who are located in the Northwest versus the Southwest versus the Midwest? So first, if we look at our Ttest results from water rights quantified, we can see that we got significant results on income, agriculture products sold, population, and proximity to major city. We can see that our tribes that had their water rights quantified actually had lower income levels. They had higher revenue from agriculture products sold. They had higher population levels, and they were more likely to be close to a major city. And these results were all significant at a 10 to 1% level. Next, if we look at casino operation, the variables that were significant here were our income and our population variables. So our reservations that had a casino versus those that did not have a casino, income levels were higher, as well as their population levels. And then lastly, if we look at the proximity to major city, our variables that were significant here were our water rights and our unemployment. So our tribes that were located close to a major city, and if we look, really we only had 20 tribes in our study that were located close to a major city. 60% of them had their water rights quantified, and they had a lower unemployment rate. So what patterns did we really see collectively from those Ttest analysis on those variables? We see that the tribes that had quantified their water rights through negotiations or settlements, they had higher agriculture revenues. Second, they were more likely to operate a casino. Third, they were more likely to be located close to a major city. And lastly, we really saw that tribes that had casinos had higher annual household incomes compared to tribes who did not. So next, if we look at regions, we split up our tribes located on Northwest tribes, Southwest tribes, and Midwest tribes. And we got significant results on the differences between them related to water rights, casino, their income level, and agriculture products sold. So we can see if we look at Northwest tribes, they were the most likely to have quantified their water rights, and they had the highest income levels on average. Where our Midwest tribes were the least likely to have quantified their water rights, but they were the most likely to operate a casino. And for our Southwest tribes, they actually had a statistically significant difference on their agriculture products sold versus the other ones. So what does that really mean? What patterns did we observe from this overall? We saw that our Northwest tribes, again, have significantly higher rates of water quantification. Our Midwest tribes have the highest prevalence of casino operations. Our Southwest has the smallest portion of tribes with casino operations. Who knows why that is? Maybe Las Vegas is taking all their business. But lastly, tribes were included based on data availability. So we could not observe all tribes, and it does not represent tribes as a whole. So I'll let Dr. Colby continue.
So we did observe some very interesting patterns, both in regional differences. And it's important, again, remember, these were just 51 different tribal nations scattered across the Midwest and Western United States. And everyone always says, well, why those 51? They were the only 51 tribal nations for which all of the different kinds of data we needed to look at were available, including the agricultural data, which was the most limiting in terms of value of agricultural products sold and other information about farming activities on reservations. So we saw some interesting patterns, certainly intriguing, but we could not take these patterns and say, well, this represents all federally, by the way, these were all federally recognized tribes as well. We could not say this represents all tribal nations or all federally recognized tribal nations in these regions. It's just a sampling to get all of us thinking about different pathways that tribal nations choose and are considering in terms of economic activities on the reservation. Now, naturally, we would have loved to know, well, does a tribe going through a process to quantify its water rights, and the processes that were included in this study were the negotiated settlement process, which has been pursued by dozens of tribal nations, primarily in the Western states, negotiating with federal agencies, with state governments, with non-Indian water resource users in their area, and eventually arriving at a negotiated settlement that is then ratified by the tribal government, by the state government, and by Congress. That was one of the water quantification pathways we looked at. The other one, though, which we hadn't mentioned yet in this webinar, but is referred to in the article, is the pathway of litigation, which has also been very important to tribes in quantifying water rights and protecting and exercising sovereign authority over tribal water resources. And that's where, rather than a negotiated settlement, it's a litigation process and a finalized court decree that affirms tribal rights of a specific quantity, seniority, and so on in their region. So we were curious, well, does quantifying water rights bring about other economic activities, or does activities like having a casino and the revenues come from it? Does that prompt tribes perhaps to then pursue water rights negotiation? We thought we might see some kind of cause and effect pathway there, but it turned out, if you asked which ones came first, a water rights quantification, achieving a water rights quantification through settlement and or court decree by a tribe, or a casino is about split evenly, actually. So it's not that one always comes first and leads to the other. And we also took similar explorations with other of the variables, like agricultural products on the reservation and agricultural activities. Water in most of the regions we studied is absolutely essential for agricultural production, certainly among the western and the southwestern regions, tribes that we examined. So does having active agriculture prompt a tribe to pursue water rights quantification to protect its agriculture, or once a water rights quantification is achieved, does that lead to more agriculture? We saw examples of both in our sampling of tribes in these regions. So what that leads us to is something that I think is very exciting for all of you who work thinking about pathways to greater economic resilience and economic vitality for tribal communities, and that is we need even more site-specific in-depth studies that illustrate the diverse pathways that tribal leaders choose and implement on behalf of their communities to ensure many generations of livelihood opportunities and economic vitality for tribal peoples in these regions of the United States. With that, we're concluding our presentation and happy to take questions, which Karletta is going to facilitate.
Yes, thank you, Bonnie. I really enjoyed Bonnie and Suhina. Thank you so much for your presentation. At this time, we'll take questions. Please submit your questions via the chat box. We have a couple of questions that have been submitted at this time, and I'll go ahead and ask those questions. The first question is, what is the size of a major city in your analysis? What's the definition?
Thank you for your question. What we chose to be a major city was if it had a population of 100,000 or more. So we used the top 10 100,000 populated cities that were nearby within a 50-mile radius.
So we were actually aiming for the possibility for employment in an urban area, which is not available from many tribal reservations with a reasonable commute, but for the cities that were designated as proximate to a major city there. That would be an interesting trade-off, work commuting to a major city off the reservation and then the livelihood opportunities on the reservation. What does that mix imply for tribal communities?
Yeah, in addition, like as we're located in Arizona, we see that since cities also have to use a lot of water and it's limited, sometimes that also causes for negotiation of water rights between tribes and cities. Thank you for your question.
Another question we have is the numbers indicated on the slide in equals do not correspond to the number of tribes, which is 51, included in the population in the database. What do these numbers represent?
So in the year 2010, there were only 41 tribes in these regions that had data from all the different sources we needed to draw upon for those tribal nations. And in 2015, there were 10 additional nations that could be added. So there were 51 tribes total, and many of them appeared in both the 2010 and the 2015 data. They were they were represented in both years. So I think that might be what you're, I think that might be responding to your question, but feel free to ask for more clarification.
The next question is, Ed Bennett, what direction can future research take? What problems do you foresee this research aiding in?
Well, this was really a broad brush overview look across a number of reservations. And my experience in working with tribal councils and tribal agency staff is for specific tribal nations with their specific goals and objectives, in-depth work on economic opportunities, current livelihood opportunities, salaries, unemployment on reservations is extremely useful. So since every nation is unique, not only in its natural resource base, its location, its culture, I think it really argues for more emphasis on in-depth reservation-specific studies. It was fun to see what could be learned with a broad brush approach using publicly accessible data, but to us, it said, wow, we need lots of people motivated to drill down, those who work for tribal agencies, who report to tribal council members, and others who work with tribal nations.
Another question just came in, and this individual asked, from an agricultural perspective, do you know if the production was primary production or whether or not the tribes were engaged in the value-added food processing, direct marketing, etc.?
Really great question, and the answer varies, of course, by a location, by tribal reservation. The information we were showing in terms of agricultural products sold in general was not value added, that it was cotton, wheat, other crops, alfalfa and hay harvested from the fields rather than, for example, ginned cotton, which had been further processed, or wheat that had been transformed into a product ready to sell directly to consumers or cereal manufacturers. But there are great examples of tribal nations that do have value-added activities on their reservation in which agricultural products from farms on the reservation are processed and facilities also located on the reservation.
I encourage the listeners, if you have a question, to go ahead and type it into the chat box. Another question was asked, did you test the 2010 and 2015 data separately? If so, did the same relationships hold?
We did test it separately, and some of the same relationships held, but it was not as clear, and it's because if we do it separately, it gives it's a much more limited sample size, and with our analysis technique we want to have more tribes together to look at them more consistently.
So it was very useful to look at them separately as well as together. And of course, the thing that one can think about going into the future is some of this data are only collected about every 5 years, but they are collected every 5 years. Perhaps in the future it'll be more often, so there'll be more opportunities to look at change over time, which I think the questionnaire was emphasizing in a valuable way would be useful for future researchers to do.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note that, why did we start this in 2010? And it's really because the USDA didn't start collecting a lot of this data until that time.
For the reservation.
For the reservation
geographic
level.
Scale.
Okay, interesting. Another question is, are water rights defined differently across tribes? If so, how does that impact your study?
Oh, that's a fabulous question. It should certainly be its own webinar, but it would actually be economists, not be the specialty people dealing with that. That would be the extremely talented set of attorneys who work directly for tribal governments or of counsel to tribal governments on their water matter. But in brief, yes, there are different kinds of water quantification processes, and one could say different kinds of water rights held by tribal nations. For example, some tribal nations emphasize in-stream flow rights because a primary goal is to protect fisheries, and this is very important in salmon country in the Pacific Northwest. And other tribes are most interested in protecting their right to use groundwater in the area of the reservation, others most interested in surface water. So there are varieties of water entitlements and uses to which tribes put those water entitlements.
We actually got a couple questions related to the water rights, so they're pretty similar. So I'll go ahead and ask both of them. So were any of the Midwest tribes east of the Mississippi where water appropriations and water rights differ than the Western state? And if so, was that accounted for? And then similarly, another question on water rights related to water rights for different tribes in the U.S. and how they're contentious and extremely nuanced. Are tribal nations beholden to the prior appropriation system Western states followed? If they aren't, how are tribal nations able to establish water resources infrastructure?
So that's a great set of questions, and it certainly deserves a more in-depth answer than we are able to give here. So tribal governments are not beholden to state governments in terms of quantifying water rights and the prior appropriation doctrine. However, as the prior appropriation doctrine has been applied, tribal water entitlements in many cases date to the date that the reservation was established by treaty, by act of Congress, or by other federal act. So there is quite a complex interplay between history, establishment of reservations, and establishment of quantity and seniority for tribal water rights. This is a very sensitive topic because many tribes argue those rights should date back to time immemorial, that is, for as long as tribal people have been managing resources and living in the region in which the water is subject to these quantification processes. And there was another part to that question, but I'm not sure that I remember it.
Okay. I'll go ahead and ask the last question and we'll wrap up. So if a tribal member is a subsistence farmer, which I think is someone who grows their own food and doesn't grow a lot of extra to sell, their income level is pretty low, I assume. Are they considered unemployed?
So I will go ahead and answer that. And this is self-reported, so it's up to that person and the reservation to tell us if they consider that person to be unemployed or not. And that same stuff works for the agriculture data too. That's reported from the reservation to the Bureau and to the USDA.
Thank you. So that implies that the meaning of the term unemployed, as well as measure of agricultural products sold, might vary from tribal nation to tribal nation, since it's a government to government relationship in which that information is reported from a tribal nation to a federal agency and then made available in publicly accessible websites. The question is a really important one because growing one's food, having one's own livestock is an important, can be a very important way of life, and it often is not valued by conventional measures. So that's a theme that it would be useful to pursue in future studies and future work with tribal nations, is what are the important food and quality of life aspects of informal or subsistence reservation agriculture. Thank you so much for raising that.
Thank you so much, Bonnie, Colby, and Suhina, Deol, for your presentation today. It was wonderful to learn about tribal economies as it relates to especially water rights. And so please read more in detail their paper, which is online on the UCAWR website. At this time, I will go ahead and turn the presentation over to Dr. Ryan Emanuel. Dr. Ryan Emanuel is an associate professor and university faculty scholar in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources at North Carolina State University. He is an environmental scientist interested in water, natural ecosystems, and society. His research team uses fieldwork, remote sensing, and modeling to study watershed-scale eco-hydrologic processes, continental-scale trends in stream flow and carbon cycling and effects of human infrastructure on hydrologic and ecological processes. Ryan is an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe and partners with Native American tribes and organizations on initiatives related to policy and education. Dr. Emanuel will be talking today on climate change in the Lumbee River watershed and potential impacts on the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina.
Thanks, Karletta, and thank you all for allowing me to be part of this webinar today and for being part of the special issue of this journal. My motivation for doing this work stems from a lack of published scholarship on climate change impacts on indigenous peoples of the southeastern United States. There are a few case studies. Many of them come from the Gulf Coast, and some others come from the Appalachian Mountains, but there are a few that deal with people living in the coastal plain of the southeastern part of this country. And it's actually a big deal here in North Carolina. So to give you some demographic background, here's a map showing American Indian populations in select counties of the southeastern United States. North Carolina has the largest Native American population east of the Mississippi River, with over 120,000 people in the last census. And the vast majority of those Native Americans in North Carolina live in the eastern half of the state. And many of them belong to tribes that lack federal recognition. So you can see in the western part of North Carolina, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians is the only tribe in North Carolina that has full federal recognition. There are 7 other tribes in North Carolina. You can see their names listed here. And these orange areas outline tribal statistical areas as defined by states and census bureaus, et cetera. And so in the eastern part of the state, many of these tribes identify themselves strongly with particular rivers, wetlands, and specific waterways. So Lumbee people in particular identify with the Lumber or Lumbee River. So a few years ago, the Lumbee Tribal Council passed an ordinance calling on the name of the river to be referred to as Lumbee in connection with the tribe. And so here's a photo here of our Blackwater stream, Blackwater because of the high amount of dissolved organic carbon in the water. But it is a historically and culturally significant river to Lumbee people. Religiously, many Lumbee people identify as Christian, and there have been baptisms in the river for generations. At the lower left, you see an artist's drawing of the Lowry Gang, which was an armed guerrilla band that fought against injustices by the Confederate government and later by the Reconstructionist government in eastern North Carolina for about a decade during the 1860s and 1870s. And they were seen by many in the Lumbee community and in the African American community as freedom fighters and Robin Hood type characters. And they made their base in the swamps. And so they took refuge in these swamps and wetlands and benefited from the fact that they could navigate these wet and inhospitable landscapes in ways that Army and law enforcement and other outsiders could not. On the right-hand side, this is an image following a famous confrontation between Lumbees and the Ku Klux Klan in 1958. Commonly referred to as the Battle of Hayes Pond, in which Lumbee people leveraged their knowledge of the swamps and wetlands to surround and rout a small Klan gathering on the outskirts of our community in the 1950s. So the river and its associated wetlands play an extremely significant role in Lumbee history, Lumbee culture, and our stories that we tell about ourselves. If we zoom out and we look at land cover imagery of the Lumbee River Basin, we see a couple of things. So here's a map of the river basin, an inset showing you the location of the Lumbee River in eastern North Carolina. The colors here are general categories of land cover. You see in the northwest, lots of green. That corresponds to forest, predominantly longleaf pine, because the river has its headwaters at the western edge of the coastal plain in an area known as the Sandhills. This was once a fire-dominated longleaf pine system. It's on the edge of Fort Bragg, a large military reservation that maintains a large conservation program for longleaf pine and related species. And so you see that show up here in the land cover imagery. Lots of this pine forest still remains. As you move to the southeast, you see more browns, and that corresponds to predominantly row crop agriculture. And then you see small areas of red and pink, which correspond to development within the basin. These are relatively small towns, the county seats of a couple of different counties. One thing that I'd like to point out on this land cover map is the ubiquitous nature of streams and wetlands. So the wetlands are really the dominant feature of land cover for this particular watershed. The Lumbee River in particular has wide riparian wetlands, as does its tributaries. And these wetlands extend like fingers throughout the entire watershed. And they are really the defining characteristic of land cover and of the landscapes in general. They define connectivity throughout the landscape, and they really set the stage. And when we drive around eastern North Carolina, we often think of these flat, open farm fields, but really these are the interstitches between these large tracts of riparian wetland. And the inset over on the right-hand side shows you that as you zoom in to an even finer scale, you see even richer textures of wetlands across the landscape. And the lower right-hand panel shows you elevation. And even though it's very subtle in the coastal plain, we still have some relief, and that relief is the template on which many of these wetlands sit. Historically, these wetlands provided isolation for Lumbee people and allowed communities to grow and to thrive. Lumbees have historically raised tobacco, and here are some historic photos of tobacco farming from the early part and the mid part of the 20th century in Lumbee communities. And most of this was done on the uplands between wetlands and streams. Today, many Lumbees still farm, but we also have a diversified economy. We have cultural ambassadors, and we're part of what's often called a pan-Indian movement. So on the lower right-hand side, these are ambassadors from the Longest Walk, a cross-country movement to raise awareness about anti-violence. And then the Lumbee tribe has a government complex in the lower left-hand corner. One interesting note is that Robeson County, North Carolina, which is where the Lumbee tribe is seated in modern times, is the epicenter of solar energy production in North Carolina, with almost $500 million in investments in solar energy over a recent 10-year period. So climate is temperate and seasonal. This is common of many places in the southeastern U.S. There's a slight bias towards more rainfall in the summertime, 1,200 to 1,300 millimeters per year average of rainfall. Temperatures range from an average low of about 7 degrees in January to an average high of about 26 degrees in July or August. One interesting trend that we see if we look through climatological data, and these are data that are aggregated for the southeastern quadrant of North Carolina by the State Climate Office, we see this interesting decay in the relationship between temperature and precipitation during certain months of the year. So summertime temperature and precipitation for much of the historical record was significantly correlated. And the correlation was negative, meaning that we would typically have warm summer weather associated with dry weather, and cooler summer weather would be associated with wet weather. But beginning in the mid-20th century, this correlation began to deteriorate. And somewhere around the last 2 decades of the 20th century, we lost significance in that correlation. And that's signified by these dots, which represent 30-year averaging periods rising above the dashed line, which is the threshold of statistical significance. there is literature discussing the role of the North Atlantic subtropical high or the Bermuda high and moving back and forth across the Atlantic and modulating summertime weather in this part of the country. So these warm, dry conditions tend to come from continental air masses moving across the Midwestern United States. These wet summer conditions come from air masses that move up from the Gulf of Mexico. And so this shows that over the past few decades, we have had this decay in the predictability of precipitation during the summertime in eastern North Carolina. This has implications for continued agriculture in Lumbee territory. We still grow a large amount of tobacco in this region, even though it has declined in the past 20 years or so. And there's a lot of industrialized agriculture in this region. That is industrialized meat production, pork, and poultry. And in many of these operations, the waste products are held on site and then irrigated by spraying them into fields. And so there are rules on the spraying of agricultural wastewater. And so losing your predictability in trends in summertime precipitation affects your ability to grow things like tobacco and affects the timing of when you can and cannot spray waste products from industrialized animal production. We have the advantage of long-term stream flow records on the Lumbee River. And so this is a summary of the annual cycle of stream flow on the Lumbee River from a USGS stream gauge that's been in place since the 1930s. And we can see this typical annual cycle, the seasonality, where we tend to experience our highest stream flows in the spring, and we have this long period of low flows throughout the summer and early fall. This is very typical of many places in the southeastern United States. So if we go back and we mine these data, we can look at 40-year periods stretching back through the historic record. And we find that over the past several decades, we've experienced significant declines in low flow percentiles. So these are the 5th lowest and the 10th lowest percentiles of flow in the Lumbee River had been declining for the past few decades, at least. This has implications for many of the cultural, recreational, and economic uses of the river. So the river has actually been designated as a national wild and scenic river. It's the only blackwater stream in North Carolina that holds that designation. It's also home to a linear state park. It's very popular regionally as a place for recreation. And so some of these photos show local members of the community. It's a very popular spot for swimming and for paddling. I also want to post a cover of this book up here that was published several years ago by members of the Lumbee community, in which they cataloged many culturally significant plants. And members of my research group went through this a few years ago and were able to key some of these plants in terms of their association with different U.S. Army Corps of Engineers wetland designation categories. And we found that about a quarter of the plants in this book were obligate or facultative wetland plants. So increasing summertime temperatures, reducing stream flow has implications for the health of these streams and the attendant wetland plants. We have looked at some statistically downscaled climate projections for this region. And one of the starkest findings is that under the business as usual scenario, summertime temperatures are expected to increase on average by about 6 degrees Fahrenheit. I apologize for putting this in Fahrenheit, but this is a slide that I commonly give in public presentations. So we can do the math and figure out that it's about 3-point-something degrees Celsius. This has implications for many of our cultural gatherings, which occur during the summertime, including Lumbee Homecoming, which happens in early July. And this is the exact part of the year that's supposed to experience the greatest increases in temperature. I'd like to connect this with some recent research, came out last year in Science and reproduced in a figure here from the New York Times, showing the inequality associated with climate change in the United States. And what this map shows is on a county by county basis across the U.S., how much of the county's GDP is expected to be lost due to the impacts of climate change by the end of this century on a business as usual scenario. And I've highlighted Robeson County and neighboring Scotland County. These are both part of Lumbee tribal territory. And these are the most severely impacted places in North Carolina in terms of this analysis, with Robeson County projected to lose about 11% of its GDP by the end of the century per year due to the economic impacts of climate change. And so these could be things like agricultural losses, but they could also be things like hurricane impacts. And here are recent years of hydrograph data and showing Hurricane Matthew, which just blew away every other flood in the record. And so it is a catastrophic event that the people in Robeson County, including members of the Lumbee community, are still dealing with today. And so not all of these impacts were related to the immediate flooding and loss of transportation and these other impacts. Some of them were longer lasting. Many places in the Lumbee community experienced washouts of critical roads and other infrastructure that took several months to repair. And then on the left, you can see massive amounts of sand were dumped in neighborhoods and towns all over the region. So just to sum up, I'd like to say that Lumbee people have strong historical, cultural, and socioeconomic ties to the river and the adjacent wetlands. The main things that we see from climate change in terms of projections today are significantly warmer summers, and precipitation is likely to be less predictable. So low summer flows on the river and more variable flows year-round have certain risks associated with them, and those risks will propagate through to the cultural and identity conceptions that Lumbee people have about the river. One thing that I didn't connect to very strongly in this talk, but you can read about in the paper, is the fact that the non-federal status of the Lumbee and many of the other tribes in this region poses challenge to many tribes in the coastal plain in terms of their ability to adapt to and deal with the impacts of climate change. Lumbee tribe has had some success here in that they've been able to secure funds from FEMA, for example, and those funds are available to everyone and not specifically to tribes. And I would also like to note that this era of climate change is impacting the Lumbee tribe at the exact same time that we're seeing a cultural resurgence. And so that brings both challenges and opportunities that I've laid out in a little more detail in the paper. And with that, I would like to close and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ryan, for your presentation. I think it's wonderful that your contribution to climate change literature specifically impacts to the Lumbee tribe. At this time, I would like to take questions. Are there any questions out there from the attendees related to Dr. Emanuel's talk? Please submit your questions in the chat box. Okay, when the question came up, does the tribe have a climate adaptation plan?
That's a great question. The answer is no, not yet. Like many tribes, our administration wears a number of hats. And so we at this time do not even have members of the tribal administration who are dedicated to environmental affairs. So these things are handled on an as-needed basis by people whose main job might be related to some other facet of tribal government. But this is one of the capacity building things that the tribe currently lacks. But there's a growing recognition that it's important not only to have a climate adaptation plan, but to have people and resources dedicated to developing and implementing a plan like this.
Great. Another question is, how would federal status of the Lumbee tribe change what could be done about climate change?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so it's a little more ambiguous when it comes to climate change, but I can give you a good example when it comes to dealing with other environmental impacts. So right now, when it comes to federal decision making related to environmental impacts, so whenever the federal government prepares an environmental impact statement, they are required under the terms of NEPA and the National Historic Preservation Act to offer formal consultation with tribes and to take the products of that consultation and consider it during the environmental decision-making process. For tribes that lack federal recognition, there's a recommendation by federal agencies that shape policy that agencies offer consultation to non-federal tribes, but there's no statutory requirement for government agencies to enter into those consultations. And so right now, for example, the tribe is dealing with lack of formal consultation between government agencies and the tribal government on a major environmental issue. But when it comes to climate change, there are resources that are available, like training from ITEP. And ITEP is a great organization that offers climate adaptation training to tribal environmental professionals, but they are constrained in their funding because of the streams that come from the Department of Interior that sometimes limit their ability to offer spaces in their courses to non-federal tribes.
Okay, another question is, are there any efforts to connect tribal interests with state and/or federal interests to look at regional adaptation activities and to connect indigenous communities to other communities in the same region who will likely experience the same climate conditions?
Yes, and most of these come indirectly through addressing other things. So for example, recovery efforts from Hurricane Matthew have broadly covered not only the Lumbee community, but towns in the region and county governments that were affected. So there are a large number of government organizations, including tribal government, that are involved in these initiatives. And in the case of Hurricane Matthew, everybody recognizes that they're all in the same situation when it comes to vulnerability to tropical storm-related flooding. And so they may not couch it in terms of we're adapting to climate change, but they are asking and trying to address questions related to, how do we prepare for the next large flood associated with a tropical storm? And those questions are being asked across tribal government, across county governments, local governments, EMS, broadly.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I want to remind the listeners online that this webinar series is webinar 1 of 2 on emerging voices of tribal perspectives, which highlight papers from the April issue on tribal waters in the journal Contemporary Water Research and Education. I had the honor of being a special editor of this issue. I'm an assistant professor and extension specialist at the University of Arizona, where I also am a hydrologist working with tribes in various water and environmental challenges. And so it's wonderful to have this opportunity to be part of these issues. And I invite the listeners to join us for webinar number 2, which features 2 more papers on water monitoring and water quality disparities. And Otakuye Conroy-Ben will discuss her paper, Disparities in Water Quality in Indian Country. And Crystal Tulley-Cordova will follow with a talk on Navajo Nation precipitation variability from 2002 to 2015. And you can go to this link here on ucowr.org. This is an open access journal, so you can download any of these papers online. UCowr is we'll be doing other series on emerging voices in water resources, so please stay tuned for other emerging voices. And this webinar is recorded and will be available online for later viewing. Also, register for the webinar number 2, which will occur May 23rd, which I was just speaking of a few minutes ago. And then finally, UCAWR has an upcoming conference. I really enjoy these conferences every year. It brings together water research, water education, and various stakeholders. So this will be June 26th and 28th in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Please see the UCAWR website for more information. Thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.